Have you ever felt like you were being watched in your own home? Have you ever had that eerie sensation that someone was keeping an eye on you, even when you were alone? That's exactly what happened to us. My wife Emily and I were thrilled about our new house. There was something special about finally having a place of our own, away from cramped apartments and city noise. We found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and with a garden that promised many sunny afternoons. On moving day, the weather was perfect. The sun was shining, and the birds chirping seemed to welcome us to our new home. We unloaded boxes and furniture, and our laughter and conversations set a joyful tone for the occasion. That's when I noticed something strange. While we were busy in the garden, I saw a figure in the window of the house next door. It was a middle-aged man with a blank, unblinking stare. He was just standing there, as if watching us. We tried to ignore it, thinking he might be a curious neighbor or just someone interested in the new people in the area. In the first few days, we maintained a superficial cordiality. We waved and tried to strike up conversations, but the man never seemed to leave his house. It was as if he was always there behind the curtains, never making contact. There was something unsettling about his presence, a feeling that he was always watching us, even when we couldn't see him. The initial incident that made us start questioning the normalcy of the situation happened on the third night we spent in the new house. We were lying in bed, trying to get used to the new environment, when we heard a noise coming from the house next door. It was the sound of heavy footsteps, followed by a faint creak as if someone was moving through the house. Emily tried to be rational, but I felt a chill run down my spine. The house was supposed to be empty. At least, that's what we thought. That night, the sense of unease grew even stronger. The shadows seemed darker, and the house next door had an aura of mystery that we couldn't explain. It was the moment we began to feel that something was profoundly wrong, and our curiosity quickly turned into a constant anxiety. The discomfort with the silent neighbor only increased. Each day seemed to bring new doubts and growing unease. We noticed strange things that we couldn't explain. Sometimes when we walked past the house next door, we felt an inexplicable sensation that something was watching us. On other days, we heard sounds that shouldn't have been there, heavy, dragging footsteps, as if someone was slowly moving from one room to another. Emily and I decided we needed to understand what was happening. We began our investigation discreetly. We talked to some of the nearby neighbors, but they didn't seem to know much about the man next door. A few mentioned that he was a recluse, but nothing beyond that. The conversations left us feeling frustrated, as if we were searching for answers in a place where there were none to be found. So, we decided to dig deeper. We researched online about the house and the neighborhood. We found out that the neighbor, a man named Henry, was known for having a peculiar personality. He was someone who rarely left his home and never seemed to have a social life. That's when we came across a mention that caught our attention. Henry had disappeared years ago. Apparently, he had been reported missing for a long time before his body was found. With this information, we went to the local library to dig up more details. We researched old newspaper archives and public records. That's when we uncovered the shocking truth. Henry had died over a decade ago. His body had been found in his own home, in an advanced state of decomposition. The cause of death was never fully clarified, but what troubled us most was that no one had been able to explain how he seemed to be standing there, day after day, watching our house. The revelation was a shock to us. Learning that the man we had seen every day had been dead for so long made the atmosphere in our house even more oppressive. The strange events intensified. We began to see Henry's figure more clearly in different spots in the house next door. The feeling of being watched turned into a constant and threatening presence. Driven by fear and curiosity, we decided we needed to confront the mystery once and for all. With each passing night, it felt as though Henry's presence grew stronger, more tangible, and the sense that something terrible was lurking became unbearable. It was as if Henry himself was trying to send us a message, and the tension we felt seemed to grow with each passing day. The unease reached an unbearable point. Every shadow, every noise seemed amplified by Henry's constant presence. We decided we couldn't continue living like this. We needed to confront whatever was haunting us, even if it meant directly facing whatever remained in the house next door. On a particularly quiet night, we decided to enter Henry's house. Armed with flashlights and cameras, we crossed the garden and forced our way in. The sensation of intruding into a space that shouldn't be inhabited was suffocating. The walls seemed to carry an invisible weight, loaded with a tension we could almost touch. As we explored, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Every step on the creaky floorboards seemed to echo, and the shadows appeared to move in strange ways. The house was in a state of disrepair, but there were still signs that someone or something had been there. We saw dusty furniture, cobweb-covered curtains, and personal items left as if they had been abandoned suddenly. The fear intensified when we found a portrait on the wall, a photo of Henry, the man we had seen so many times. It was when we started hearing whispers, faint and almost imperceptible, that we realized we weren't alone. The voices seemed to come from the walls, whispering our names. Fear took hold of us, but we pressed on, determined to understand what was happening. Eventually, we managed to get out of the house, exhausted and terrified. We ran back to our home, and the palpable sense of relief as we shut the door behind us was undeniable. We knew we couldn't stay there any longer. The experience had scarred us permanently, and we decided to sell the house immediately. In the epilogue, we tried to rebuild our lives in a new place, but the impact of what we went through never left us. The house next door remained empty and in ruins, a constant reminder of the terror we faced. Sometimes at night we still feel a shiver, as if Henry's presence is following us, a haunting mystery we may never fully understand. The shadows of the past continue to haunt us, and the feeling that something terrible is still watching us has never completely faded. I never imagined that a simple camping trip could turn into a nightmare. It was just me and 5 friends, all excited and full of energy, seeking an adventure in a remote forest that no one in our group knew very well. The idea was to escape our routine, disconnect from technology, and enjoy nature in its purest form. The forest was dense and dark, with trees that seemed to touch the sky and a thick mist that never seemed to completely clear. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon. The environment was both fascinating and unsettling. The massive trees and the ground covered in dry leaves gave the impression that we were entering a place untouched by man. Excitement was in the air. We set up our tents near a slow-moving stream that made a gentle sound that should have been relaxing, but instead, it felt like a constant whisper. As night approached, we began preparing the campfire. The crackling flames and the welcoming warmth contrasted with the growing darkness around us. We told scary stories, laughed, and made plans for the next morning. Fear and discomfort were not on our minds that night. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. However, the atmosphere around us began to change. We noticed that the shadows cast by the trees were dancing in a strange way, as if they were alive. Every time a branch moved, it felt like something or someone was sneaking between the trees. The sound of falling leaves and the murmur of the stream began to blend with more strange and disturbing noises. It was as if a faint whisper was being carried by the wind, but it vanished whenever we tried to listen more closely. The first sign that something was wrong came when we heard footsteps behind us. It wasn't the sound of breaking branches or animals moving. It was the clear, deliberate sound of heavy footsteps. We quickly turned around, but the darkness of the forest seemed to swallow whatever was there. We tried to rationalize it, telling ourselves it was just an animal or our minds playing tricks on us, but the discomfort was growing. The shadows on the trees seemed to move with an almost supernatural speed, and the stream had turned into a more unsettling murmur than before. Something was definitely wrong, but that night, with the campfire crackling and our voices mingling, we chose to ignore the ominous feeling, unaware that we were about to plunge into a terror we had never imagined. As the night wore on, what began as a mild unease quickly turned into something more sinister. The strange noises around us were no longer intermittent. They were becoming a constant, unsettling presence. Heavy footsteps, muffled growls, and that same whisper that seemed to echo between the trees, never clearly audible. The sensation of being watched intensified with each passing moment. The shadows on the trees seemed to come alive, moving in erratic and almost intelligent ways. We tried to distract ourselves, but the invisible presence around us was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time a branch broke or a leaf moved, Our hearts leapt into our throats. We tried to laugh nervously and make jokes, but the tension was palpable. Our eyes constantly darted to the edges of the clearing, where the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. Our first attempt to investigate what was happening was a disaster. Armed with flashlights and courage, we decided to explore the area around our campsite. Every step toward the deeper forest felt like a violation of the safe space we had created. The sound of our own footsteps seemed amplified by the darkness, and the feeling that something was following us was overwhelming. Suddenly, one of our friends, Mark, screamed. He had seen something, a shadow moving quickly between the trees. We rushed to where Mark had pointed, but what we found was even more disturbing. An area of the forest where the ground was disturbed, and tracks of something large and heavy were visible in the dirt. Mark was visibly shaken, but we insisted on continuing the investigation. Then, amid the growing confusion and fear, he disappeared, simply vanished without a trace. His screams echoed in the darkness, and we found ourselves in a state of absolute panic. The search for Mark turned into a desperate race. We found only more blood trails, scattered among the trees as if he were being dragged away. Each piece of evidence seemed to lead us deeper into a chasm of terror. The blood, mingled with dirt and dry leaves, seemed to be guiding us toward a fate we didn't want to face. Panic had completely set in among us. As we tried to make sense of what was happening, more members of the group began to disappear. With each new search, we found more blood trails and less hope. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the shadows were denser and more menacing than ever. Every strange sound, every fleeting shadow was a constant reminder that we were being hunted by something we couldn't see or understand. The atmosphere was charged with despair. The trees seemed to bend over us, and the sound of our own screams was muffled by the darkness. The sense that the forest itself was alive and conspiring against us was almost palpable. Each moment felt like an eternity, and the presence of something malevolent seemed to be growing stronger. The fight for survival became more desperate with every passing minute. Despair and terror reached an unbearable point. The forest had become a labyrinth of darkness and fear, and the threatening presence hunting us seemed to intensify with every moment. Determined to uncover what lay behind all this horror, we mustered our remaining strength and pushed into the heart of the forest. It was then that the truth emerged before us, cruel and terrifying. In a hidden clearing, illuminated only by the faint light of our flashlights, we found what appeared to be a macabre altar. Broken stones and human bones were scattered around a structure made of intertwined branches and roots. The nauseating stench of rotting flesh hung in the air, and the shadows around us moved in such a sinister way that it almost seemed like they had a life of their own. And then, the creature revealed itself. There were no words to describe what we saw. It was a nightmare abomination, a grotesque fusion of human and animal, with claws as sharp as blades and eyes glowing with a malevolent, intelligent light. The sound it made was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from a primordial evil place. The confrontation was swift and brutal. The creature advanced on us with surprising speed, its presence overwhelming and almost tangible. We tried to fight with everything we had, but its claws sliced through the air with deadly precision. We screamed and ran, our cries blending with the sound of its claws striking the ground. With every movement, the sensation that terror itself was consuming us grew more intense. Each step felt like a step closer to the abyss. Some of us managed to escape, but at a terrible cost. Desperation guided us through the forest, fleeing from what seemed to be an unrelenting predator. Adrenaline and fear drove us, but the sense of loss was crushing. Those who escaped were never the same. Their minds, scarred by horror, could barely process what had happened. In the epilogue, the impact of our experience was evident. Our nightmares became a constant part of our lives. The forest remained as a haunted place, a scar on the map and on our psyche. The full story was never fully revealed, and unanswered questions hung over us like a constant shadow. Wherever we went, the fear that something similar could happen again never left us. The forest remained shrouded in mystery and terror, a constant reminder of what we faced and what might still be there, waiting for its next victim. The antique store was a maze of old objects, covered in dust and forgotten stories. I never imagined that a simple visit to such a place could lead to one of the biggest nightmares of my life. It was an ordinary day, and I was just looking for a new item to decorate my apartment. Amidst old furniture and worn porcelain, something caught my eye. A striking mirror with a golden ornament and intricate frame. Its peculiar shine seemed almost hypnotic, as if it were trying to draw me closer. The seller, a man with an enigmatic and weary look, spoke about the mirror in a way that made buying it feel almost like a ceremony. He told me the mirror was made over a century ago and had belonged to an old mansion. It all sounded fascinating, like I was acquiring a piece of the past, a fragment of an era long lost. At no point did I imagine I was bringing home something that could end up haunting me. When I finally hung the mirror on my apartment wall, it seemed like the perfect addition to my space. The reflection it offered was clear and elegant, and I was pleased with my purchase. In the first few days, everything seemed normal. The mirror's presence was welcoming, a decorative piece that fit well with the rest of the room. But then things started to change. At first it was just small details. Sometimes as I walked through the room, I had the sense that something in the mirror was out of place, but I always dismissed it as just my imagination playing tricks. Then I began to see an indistinct shadow in the corner of the mirror, a figure that seemed to move but would disappear whenever I tried to look closer. It was as if the shadow was part of a macabre game, always visible but never fully clear. At first I tried to ignore the strange reflections, convincing myself that it was just an illusion. However, increasingly disturbing events began to happen. The shadow in the mirror seemed to become more defined each day, a presence that appeared to be watching my every move. I saw figures in the mirror moving in inexplicable ways, as if they were trying to communicate or escape from some invisible prison. The most unsettling moments were those when the shadow seemed to take shape, as if it were drawing closer to me. The figures in the mirror were not just reflections, they moved with intent, as if they were trying to reach out to me. I began to feel an increasing sense that the mirror was not merely a decorative object, but a gateway to something that should remain closed. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or an anomaly, but the feeling of being watched never faded. As days went by, what was once a vague discomfort turned into an oppressive presence. The dark figure in the mirror was no longer just a shadow, but a constant, almost tangible presence. Sometimes I saw it clearly, a vague figure with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to watch me with a fixed, penetrating gaze. Each night the feeling of being watched grew more intense. I could no longer distinguish if I was seeing the reflection of my own shadow or something more sinister. The mirror became the center of my restless nights. As I tried to sleep, the shadow moved, always searching for something. There were times when I felt as if the entire house was becoming an extension of that disturbing reflection. The atmosphere around the mirror seemed charged with a dark, threatening energy. There was no longer any denying that something was terribly wrong. Desperate to understand what was happening, I decided to investigate the history of the mirror. With the help of the internet and some visits to the local library, I began to search for information about the mirror and its origins. What I discovered was beyond anything I could have imagined. The first clue came from an obscure forum discussing ancient objects and their sinister histories. An anonymous user mentioned an old mirror that once belonged to a notorious serial killer, known for his cruelty, and for using the mirror to spy on his victims. Intrigued and terrified, I pursued historical records and old articles. The killer, named Victor Hellman, had committed a series of brutal crimes over a century ago. He used the mirror to observe his victims in secret, terrorizing them before ultimately killing them. According to the accounts, the mirror was one of his most perverse instruments, allowing him to spy on and manipulate people in cruel ways. With my heart racing, I gathered more information and discovered that the mirror had been found in his house after his arrest and execution. Several documents and records indicated that he believed the mirror had special powers to capture and hold the souls of his victims. Evidence suggested that he saw the mirror as a way to extend his influence even after his death. The most horrifying discovery came when I found an entry in an investigator's diary from that time, describing a terrifying scene. The mirror seems to have a will of its own, a persistent presence. Victims reported seeing figures in the mirror, figures that moved and whispered as if the essence of the killer was trapped within. Reading these words, horror settled in completely. The dark figure in the mirror was not merely an illusion or a trick of the light. It was the manifestation of Victor Hellman himself, still projecting through the mirror. The shadow I saw was not just a reflection of something terrifying from the past, but a living, malignant presence trying to escape its prison. The mirror, which I had thought was merely an old object, was now revealed as a portal to unimaginable terror. Fear and paranoia became constant companions, and I realized that the mirror was not only watching me, but seemed to be feeding off my fear. What had started as simple curiosity had turned into a deep and persistent nightmare. I was trapped in a web of horror, and the dark figure was just the tip of the iceberg. Deciding to confront the terror I had inadvertently brought into my life was not easy. The dark presence in the mirror had become a constant source of fear and despair. Nights were a nightmare, and I knew I had to find a way to end it. There was no room left for doubt or hesitation. It was time to confront the entity that had taken hold of the mirror, and perhaps my own sanity. I began researching methods to exorcise or destroy haunted objects. Finding a solution was not simple, but I managed to combine ancient rituals with exorcism techniques. I prepared an environment around the mirror with candles and symbols that, according to experts, could ward off evil spirits. Deep down, I knew this might not be enough, but it was the only hope I had. On the night of the confrontation, I was as terrified as I was determined. I approached the mirror with a racing heart, feeling as though the room itself was holding its breath. The dark figure in the mirror seemed more alive than ever, its dark eyes fixed on me with a piercing intensity that felt like it was penetrating my soul. I began the ritual, reciting the words I had learned with such difficulty, but the shadow seemed to resist, writhing and growing more aggressive with each passing moment. As I proceeded with the ritual, the presence in the mirror manifested in increasingly intense ways. The shadow took on a more tangible form, a figure that seemed to try to cross the glass. I felt a growing pressure around my chest, as if an invisible force were trying to suffocate me. The environment around me became more and more oppressive, and the whispers coming from the mirror were deafening, like a cacophony of desperate and distorted voices. At the climax of the confrontation, the mirror began to vibrate violently, and I nearly fainted from terror. A shrill scream echoed through the room, a mix of rage and pain. I realized that despite all my efforts, the malevolent presence was becoming more desperate and aggressive. The mirror seemed almost to be on fire, but not from heat, rather from a dark, pulsating energy. I knew I had to act quickly. In a desperate move, I grabbed a hammer and with a scream of strength and fear began smashing the mirror. The glass shattered into pieces, and a final scream of anguish emerged from the dark figure before it vanished. However, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The pressure and fear were so intense that I could barely maintain consciousness as I fled the room. After destroying the mirror, I thought the nightmare was over, but reality proved much darker. The mirror was broken, but the sense of terror and the presence of the entity didn't completely disappear. I discovered that although the mirror was shattered, the broken pieces had been removed and apparently recycled. As I tried to recover, the feeling of being watched never truly dissipated. I was consumed by fear, and the idea that the entity might have found another way to manifest terrified me. The epilogue of this experience was marked by a sense of desolation and constant vigilance. The story of the mirror and the killer spread among friends and family, but no one seemed to understand the true extent of the horror I had endured. Even after everything, I had the sense that the mirror, or whatever it had represented, was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The mirror wasn't just an object, but a symbol of a terror that persisted, a shadow that continued to haunt my present and perhaps my future. As you distance yourself from the nightmare we've just explored, remember that terror often doesn't end when you open your eyes. The mirror, like a portal to the unknown, may have been destroyed, but the shadow of its malevolence still lurks in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. If you dare to delve into more dark stories and terrifying accounts, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here signifies that you're ready to confront the horrors that hide in the depths of the world. Leave a comment below and share your own experiences or thoughts on this story. Remember, the nightmare doesn't end when you wake up. It continues to haunt with every new click and every new tale. Stay tuned, for the next horror story might be closer than you think. Until next time, and may your dreams be less disturbing.